You know, police arrested them, prosecutors helped convict them, but when it came time to put them in prison, judges gave them a chance to run. They're found guilty, and then they're gone.
In America's crime capital, 7 Action News investigator Ross Jones has discovered that some of our area's most dangerous criminals are being given an opportunity to flee.
In a home along this suburban street, almost every weekend for nearly 2 years, a father sexually assaulted his daughter. He did it, she later testified, in this basement, starting when she was only 12.
He told me he's going to kill me or he's going to hit me.
And this is your dad?
Yep.
We're not naming or showing their faces tonight so that we can protect the innocent. The young girl's father was arrested, charged, and found guilty of criminal sexual conduct 2nd degree, headed to prison for as many as 15 years. But before he was sentenced, Judge Vonda Evans gave him one last taste of freedom by continuing his bond, a defendant's promise to return to court. It gave him 6 weeks before he'd have to report to prison. He used that chance to flee.
I feel like that he has more rights than I do. Pretty much had to go in trial, tell everybody what he did, and then they let him go, and they say, well, he has a right.
Her father never returned to court and has never seen the inside of a prison cell. Judge Evans says she stands by her decision, and the prosecutor never challenged it.
You gave him bond. He's never served a day in prison. The victim would like an apology.
I follow the law.
This scenario is all too common inside Wayne County Circuit Court, where scores of men and women who committed dangerous and assaultive crimes are guilty and then gone. Felons like Demetrius Magwood, guilty of assault with intent to murder, felony firearm, and more. Though Magwood knew he would spend possibly decades in prison, Judge Edward Ewell decided not to take him into custody right away, instead putting him on a tether until his sentencing. Well, Magwood cut his tether and ran. He's been missing for 716 days. Judge Ewell declined comment.
You've got a victim who's now almost seen justice, and you tear that out of their hands to allow this person to go free.
These men, all guilty of firearm felonies, all given bond, and all on the run. There's Danny Young, guilty of assaulting a police officer and domestic violence, 4th offense, missing 462 days. Michael Lee Bonacy pled guilty to operating while intoxicated for the 3rd time, on the run for 393 days. And there's Kenyatta Perez, guilty of armed robbery and larceny and facing years in prison. Prosecutors say they urged Judge Carol Youngblood to take her into custody immediately. Instead, she let Perez stay out another month. She's been missing for nearly a year and a half.
These are probably the most difficult people to find because they have the biggest reason to run and hide.
Justin Butler and other bail bond agents are often the last hope to find these dangerous criminals and bring them to justice. Last week, we rode along with an apprehension team trying to find men and women running from the law.
U.S. apprehension. Open the door, please.
But to prosecutors and groups like Crime Stoppers, convicted criminals shouldn't be given the chance to run in the first place.
Why should anyone who has done terrible things in our community, once they're convicted, be allowed to stay on the streets and possibly commit another crime? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Demetrius Edwards is another criminal given a few more weeks of freedom. After pleading guilty to armed robbery and felony firearm, he knew he was going to prison for up to 12 years. Citing his otherwise clean record, Judge Bruce Morrow continued Edwards' bond for a few more weeks, and the prosecutor didn't object. Hours later, that same day, police say he would shoot and kill Sidel Leverett, a father and husband, outside Eastland Mall. His wife didn't want to talk to us for this story, but did want us to know that her husband would have turned 33 this month.
He was already found guilty of armed robbery. He knew he was going away. Why even give him the chance to flee or to do something even worse?
Well, I think that the chance to do something worse depends on who you are and doesn't depend on where you are. People offend in jail, people offend in courtrooms.
But he admits Edwards wouldn't be on trial for murder today if he'd chosen to lock him up.
We do the best we can, and again, our condolences to the Leverett family.
The father we told you about in the beginning of this story, while he was on the run from his criminal sexual conduct conviction, his family learned that he died of a heart attack. They say he got the easy way out, not having to serve a day in prison for the horror he inflicted. I'm Ross Jones, 7 Action News.
They are guilty and gone. Scores of men and women convicted of dangerous, sometimes heinous crimes now on the run after a judge gave them just a little more freedom.
Last night, 7 Action News investigator Ross Jones laid out some of the startling stories. And Ross, you join us now with even more.
Indeed, Joanne, Stephen, good evening to you both. Wayne County's prosecutor said recently that if her office doesn't get more funding, some criminals may have to go free. Well, we have some bad news for the prosecutor tonight. They already are.
Judges need to err on the side of protecting the community, and sometimes I think they err on the side of protecting the criminal.
As we showed you last night, scores of convicted felons guilty of crimes as heinous as attempted murder are being given what critics say is a get-out-of-jail-free card. After being found guilty of felonies that would lock them away for years, many judges in Wayne County's 3rd Circuit Court continue these criminals' bond, their promise to come back. It gave them weeks, sometimes months more of freedom before they needed to report to prison. But instead of showing up, these criminals chose to run.
This is a convicted felon. You want that person to go straight from the court to jail to prison for a long time.
Ellis Stafford spent 23 years with the Michigan State Police, and today he's operations director at the Detroit Crime Commission, a nonprofit crime-fighting group made up of some of the state's top law enforcement officials. He says after a grueling trial, locking up a criminal should be the easy part.
It is hard to get people to come to court in a no-snitch mentality. And to get that witness to come forward, to give their statement in open court and be cross-examined. And you walk out, and at the end of the day, they're right back down the street from you. It's got to be demoralizing.
Stafford and others suspect the jail overcrowding is one reason county judges often continue bond after a conviction. And while jail space is at a premium, none of the judges we talked to for this story listed overcrowding as a reason for letting out criminals.
I don't think anybody can predict human behavior.
Judge Bruce Morrow continued the bond of Demetrius Edwards, found guilty of armed robbery. But instead of sending him straight to prison, he chose to continue Edwards' bond. Well, that same day, police say he shot and killed Sidell Leverett. We spoke with his sister today.
It didn't have to happen at all. This shouldn't have happened. And that's what hurts so bad. This young man has nothing to lose. Why would he care about the next man? And that man was my brother. That man was a son, a father. And now every day we have to live with this loneliness, this emptiness.
It's not just Leverett's family who's taking issue with Morrow's decisions. Earlier this year, the Judicial Tenure Commission accused him of letting out other criminals he shouldn't have.
I follow the law.
A man convicted of sexually assaulting a minor in Judge Vonda Evans' courtroom fled after she gave him bond. She released him with no objection from the prosecutor for another 6 weeks before sentencing. He never returned to a courtroom. But was Evans allowed to let him go in the first place? Take a look at this state statute. It says a defendant convicted of sexual assault of a minor shall be detained and shall not be admitted to bail.
Were you aware of this statute? Because that one seems pretty clear.
No, Evans told me later, she wasn't. Yesterday, she said by phone that had she read it, it would have impacted my decision. That's no comfort to the criminal's victim, who remembers the day she learned he was on the run.
I was very angry, and I started crying because I couldn't hold my anger in. I was just mad that they didn't care.
Well, yesterday, in response to what we have reported, Judge Evans sent me this statement. It reads, in every criminal case, judges are afforded great latitude and discretion regarding bond. We are now reviewing every case individually to assure that the victims' and defendants' rights are fully protected.
Now, Ross, the prosecutor spent a lot of time and money getting these people convicted. What is Kim Worthy, you mentioned her at the top, what is Kim Worthy saying about this report?
Well, we did hear from her about an hour ago. She said she expects all judges to follow the law, especially when it dictates mandatory sentences like it did in several of these cases we've told you about. She also said her own prosecutors will continue to vigorously object when judges decide to let out criminals who they believe should be locked up immediately.
All right, frustrates a lot of people and prosecutors. Ross, thank you for that.
So.
Thank you.
You know, police will tell you catching criminals is hard enough. So after they've been caught and convicted, why are judges giving them even 1 second more freedom?
Investigator Ross Jones has been digging into a head-shaking problem inside Wayne County Circuit Court for months, and tonight some elected officials say it's time to put an end to this.
Indeed, Carolyn, Stephen, the criminals involved here were not convicted of petty crimes. They're headed to prison for years for things like drug charges, assault, or even worse. So if they showed a disregard for the law before, why are judges giving them a chance to do it again? Charged, convicted,
and free to flee. Scores of criminals guilty of serious crimes, but given one last chance by a judge to delay their date with prison. As our investigation showed you Saturday, plenty have taken the chance to run. Most recently, criminals like Timothy Littles, who agreed to spend 5 years in prison. Already convicted of armed robbery and peddling cocaine, he pled to more drug and weapons charges in April. Wayne County Judge Ulysses Boykin chose to continue his bond, a promise to come back to court, for weeks and then months. Littles has been missing since July. There's Demetrius Edwards, who learned he'd spend up to 12 years in prison for armed robbery and weapons charges. But Judge Bruce Morrow chose not to lock him up immediately. Instead, he continued his freedom until sentencing scheduled weeks later. But Edwards had other plans. The night of his conviction, he went to Eastland Mall and gunned down Sidel Leverett, a father and husband.
I was appalled. The fact that people are already convicted of something. I thought about the victims' families. I mean, where's their consideration in this?
Wayne County Commissioner Ray Basham doesn't see the logic in keeping convicted criminals out in the public when they know prison is imminent. The former state legislator says the state needs to change current law that gives judges lots of leeway in deciding who should and shouldn't be locked up immediately.
And I think the state Supreme Court should be involved in this. I think the Michigan state legislature should be involved in this, because to give the judges discretion after they've already been convicted, I think is wrong.
Judges say deciding who to lock up is sometimes influenced by available jail space. While overcrowding isn't a problem in state prisons, where virtually all of these defendants would spend their sentences, the county's jails are overloaded by hundreds, and that's where these criminals are held until their sentences begin. But some commissioners we talked to thought very little of that rationale. Said Commissioner Shannon Price in an email, "This is a case of the prosecutor and the courts being penny wise and pound foolish." And Commissioner Diane Webb was even more blunt. "I cannot fathom a single rational reason why a convicted felon would be freed for a moment. I buy no excuses for this situation." Now, Michigan law says that some crimes, like sexually assaulting a child, require immediate incarceration, but most, even murder, leave the decision up to a judge. If that is going to change, it'll require action from the state legislature, and some of those commissioners we talked to tonight said that is long overdue.
All right. Ross, thank you for the report.
Victims' families call it a maddening loophole that's putting criminals back out on the street and made a mockery of law and order.
For months, 7 Action News investigator Ross Jones has been on the trail of Wayne County judges who gave felons already convicted of dangerous crimes the chance to commit even more.
My brother was one of a kind. He was a family man. His most prized possession was his family and his children. He was just an all-around good guy who didn't deserve for this to happen to him.
Brianna Leverett last saw her big brother Sidel the day before he was murdered. The husband and father was gunned down outside Eastland Mall in 2010 by a man that a judge let free just hours earlier.
When do you miss him the most?
Every day. There's not a day that I go by without thinking of him.
The man who pulled the trigger didn't need to have the chance. That same day, he learned he'd spend up to 12 years in prison after pleading guilty to armed robbery and firearm charges. Judge Bruce Morrow could have taken him into custody then and there, but instead he gave Demetrius Edwards 6 more weeks of freedom, and the prosecutor on the case did not object. That same night, Edwards gunned down Leverett. He was found guilty of his murder last August in another judge's courtroom, and this time he was sent straight to prison. In Wayne County, some criminals are given a new lease on life. They were supposed to spend years in prison, but thanks to a judge's generosity, they're free to roam the streets. Since our last report, the problem hasn't gotten better. Over a recent 4-month stretch, 77 men and women failed to return to court after their conviction. Most of the crimes were minor enough to warrant just probation, but many did not. 4-time felon Douglas McCrae II pled guilty to 2 firearm offenses in February, agreeing to spend 5 years behind bars. Judge Margaret Van Houten scheduled his sentencing almost 4 months later, but McCrae never showed up. He's been missing for 144 days. Timothy Littles agreed to spend 5 years in prison, too. Already convicted of armed robbery and peddling cocaine, he copped to more drug and weapons charges in April. Judge Ulysses Boykin continued his bond for weeks and then months. Littles has been missing since July. And 4-time felon David Bevel pled to 2 gun charges that would put him in prison until 2018. But Judge Daniel Hathaway gave him 6 weeks until he'd be sentenced. Bevel hasn't set foot in a courtroom since.
If you want to solve the problem in Detroit, you have to solve the crime problem first. And these irresponsible judges that keep releasing these people time and time again are just creating havoc in their own communities. It breaks my heart.
None of the judges involved in these decisions agreed to talk to us for this story, except for one.
Yes, ma'am.
We met up with Judge Vonda Evans on her way to the Detroit Athletic Club with questions about first-time felon Eric Lanier, charged with armed robbery, felonious assault, and impersonating a Detroit police officer.
Here at the corner of Joy and Evergreen, a man testified that Lanier crashed into his car, got out, and showed him a police badge. He said he searched him, pointed a gun in his face, and said, "I'm going to shoot you."
After making a plea deal that included 9 months in jail and undergoing mental health screening, Lanier asked Evans to give him a few weeks to tend to serious health problems. The judge agreed, and the prosecutor did not object. Today, Eric Lanier is missing.
Well, quite naturally, I am concerned about that. But at the end of the day, we have to make a determination as who's going to be in that jail and who's not going to be in that jail.
If he does something else like what he was accused of while he's out, will you feel at all responsible?
I'm doing the best that I can. The only person that should be responsible for what people do are the people that do what they do.
Evans said deciding who to take into custody is sometimes influenced by available jail space. While overcrowding isn't a problem in state prisons, where virtually all of these defendants would spend their sentences, the county's jails are overloaded by hundreds, and that's where these criminals are held until their sentences begin.
And it's very hard always having the media always over scrutinizing what we're doing when we're trying to do the best.
As for Judge Bruce Morrow, who we mentioned at the beginning of this piece, well, months after our first report, the state's Judicial Tenure Commission held a hearing accusing him of giving other defendants bond when he shouldn't have. He's facing discipline from the Supreme Court, and Brianna Leverett hopes he gets it.
If the judge, wouldn't have gave him those few days or weeks, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. I have a brother that was killed due to him.
In Michigan, judges are afforded a great deal of leeway when deciding whether to continue a criminal's bond. With few exceptions, they can choose to give them weeks or months more of freedom unless they believe there's clear and convincing evidence the defendant will not be a danger. I'm Ross Jones, 7 Action News.